Hello, everyone. My name is Alejandra Cardini. I am the co-chair of the T20 Task Force in number 6 and the Education Program Director of CPEC Argentina. So welcome everyone to this virtual event. Good morning, good evening. We are in all different time spaces and places. So let me begin by celebrating that this is the 4th consecutive year in which we had education as a theme in the T20 and the G20. The T20 is the G20 engagement group that gathers research centers and think tanks to produce policy recommendations for the G20 discussions. And education was not always there. It was not always in the G20 discussions. It was first introduced during the Argentine presidency in 2018. And in these 4 years, we have built a very solid network of experts of more than 50 think tanks, research centers, and international agencies that gather more than 90 experts. And we have produced a total of 26 policy briefs in different educational topics. And you can see them all in the T20 website. But today I'm representing a specific group in this more wider group. And this is a group, and this particular event is a contribution of Western University, CPEC, and it's also sponsored by IIEP UNESCO. And the group of people that are especially presenting in the first panel have been working since 2020, since the pandemic and the educational emergency arose with the pandemic, to provide a specific framework and recommendations to be able to respond to this emergency and what the pandemic was producing. So this specific policy brief also has colleagues from UNICEF and INI that have also worked in a policy brief that we did last year. So the title of this specific event, The Educational Impact of COVID-19 from Messages to Action, acknowledges the importance of research to inform governments and education stakeholders to be able to design and implement policies that address the new challenges that the pandemic proposes. And this means looking at the emergency, but also at the long-term consequences and aspects that the emergency brought. So as UNESCO recent report on the future of education claims, we need a new social contract for education to repair injustices, but also to be able to think how to transform the future. We must revisit the purposes of education to ensure the right of quality. And this means a lot of work, and this means having new frameworks to think how to strengthen education as a public endeavor and a common good. So this is the spirit behind this event, and we aim to contribute to this spirit not only by providing research-based insights to deliver informed messages to the G20 and to give elements to think how to rebuild the education systems, but also to be able to shed light on different actors and what specific actions have been taking place in different countries. So in the second part of the event, we will have these experiences on the spot. So let me finish by saying how the event is organized. We have planned 2 sessions. In the first session, we will count first with Professors Prachi Srivastavas presentation of the policy brief that is titled Rebuilding Education Systems for Recovery, a Crisis-Sensitive and Equity-Focused Approach. And this policy was produced in Task Force 6, and that is the Social Cohesion and the Future of Welfare Systems Task Force in the T20. We will have probably a few words of Tito Boeri, the lead co-chair, but we might have them a bit late today. And this brief is a collaborative work of all those organizations that I mentioned at the beginning, but also of the Center of Policy Research in India that has participated this year in this specific production. So after this session, we will have a roundtable discussion with on the crisis-sensitive and equity-focused approaches in education, and we will have participation of most of the policy brief co-authors. In session 2, we will illuminate on concrete actions, as I said, experiences, very concrete experiences that are going on in different parts of the world. And the idea is to have that and show experiences of the global South context. So for this, Professor Srivastava will be moderating a set of presentations with people from Argentina, India, Indonesia, and South Africa. So thank you very much, and especially speakers, for being here today. And I will pass the word to Prachi Srivastava so she can give us the broad framework and the main aspects that the policy brief this year has put into place. The floor is yours, Prachi.
Thank you, Alejandra. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever it is you're joining us from. I'm going to take a very brief amount of time just to do a very quick overview of the policy brief that we developed this year. It builds very much on work that we started doing last year. And this year, we really focused on issues around how to look forward towards recovery, even though we are quite aware that the situation on the ground for education is still quite disrupted. As we know, there are roughly 500 million children who were actually never reached by remote learning options. And in many contexts, there is still a disrupted situation for education. Of course, the longer that this goes, the more time it takes for recovery. And it also has a much more compounded effect on groups that are already vulnerable, who are experiencing new vulnerabilities. So with taking all of those things into consideration, we presented this approach, this policy brief. Next slide, please. When we speak about crisis-sensitive planning in education, what exactly is it that we're talking about? It might seem a bit of a buzzword, but actually this approach has been used and quite, I would say, substantially elaborated on by IIEP and UNESCO. And we took this as the framing context, which means really identifying and analyzing the existing risks of conflict and natural hazards, understanding the two-way interaction between these risks and education to develop strategies that respond appropriately. Of course, we reframe this for the context of the pandemic, but it's very important to understand that we're looking at two-way interactions here. It also aims to contribute to minimizing the negative impacts of risk on education service delivery and to maximize the positive impacts of education policies. There's an issue in terms of responding in the now, but also thinking about preventing future disasters or future disruptions, and very strongly thinking about how to mitigate the effects, and specifically looking at issues of inequity and exclusion. So this was the broad framework that we started with last year, and then we applied it to the pandemic context. Next slide, please. So what did that look like? We, in our previous work, identified 4 key considerations in terms of instituting such an approach, thinking about pandemic planning and policy, and also thinking forward towards recovery. And this, in our mind, involved 4 key considerations. The first was how to manage a crisis and institute first responses. So this is very much in the beginning in terms of, you know, at the time when the school closures were announced almost en masse globally, we saw many instances of times where governments had to take quick action. So that was the first set of considerations. The second set of considerations is to be cognizant of the fact that throughout the pandemic, and I would venture even towards recovery, there will be planned and interrupted reopenings, and to think about what the appropriate measures will be. Because at a certain point, there might be some other health issues, some other infrastructure issues that come in. So it was really thinking about being cognizant of the fact that it is not going to be a one-time, in some contexts, it won't be a one-time open and close. There might be interruptions in terms of reopening. The third was really to think about sustained crisis-sensitive planning. And again, that goes back to our original framework, really thinking about the fact that this is something that isn't just for the here and now, but also you want to think for a long-term view. And as we know in education, the effects of disruption, as well as the outcomes of interaction of any education policies are long-term. They go towards almost one complete cycle. So we have to think about that in terms of going forward. And then finally, to readjust and adjust existing policies and to strengthen policy dialogue. So all of this is really trying to look at the education system as a full system. And in some countries, this might be a federal system. In other countries, this might be a decentralized system. In other countries, still, it might be highly decentralized, going all the way to micro communities. So it's really thinking about how all of those fit together to go forward. Next slide, please. So when we were thinking about this brief, and we were thinking about how to go forward from here, we were very cognizant of the fact that there are two levels of effects when we're talking about education disruption. There's an institutional level effect. Well, there are a number of institutional level effects and individual level effects. And we really do need to think of those things in combination. We can't think of one without the other. When we talk about institutional level effects, we're really looking at the inequities that might affect us in terms of the governance areas. And here we're talking about provision, finance, regulation, and management. And how might we think about strengthening those areas when we're thinking of recovery? So there are three main points that we highlight in our policy brief. The first is that we must think of extending system capacities and addressing equity concerns, and really thinking about how finance, provision, regulation, management, how that comes together in terms of the system and which parts of the system perhaps needs bolstering. The second is to be very attuned to bi-directional relationships of education with other outcomes. And here we want to be very clear that education does not operate in a silo. There are positive effects, for example, of education on health, on education and labor market participation, of education and labor, of education and child welfare, social protection. So we really need to think about what parts of the system cross over with other parts to actually produce positive outcomes. And the third, which is really related to this, is to understand that in order to achieve longer term recovery, we must really think about the cross-sectoral and multi-sectoral stakeholder coordination and collaboration. So again, what parts of the system can be bolstered, for example, by departments of health or departments of labor, departments of child welfare, departments of women and gender, where they exist. We really need to start thinking about that. And for donors, we need to start thinking of other options in terms of pooled funds, in terms of cross-sectoral support. Those are the kinds of policy actions that we recommend. And secondly, at the individual level. Now, what does this mean? This means that at the individual level, the experience of education disruption, and we're going to hear more about this in session 2, when you actually hear more about the ground experiences, the experience of education disruption is going to be mitigated very strongly by the circumstances of particular groups and their social identifiers. It might be the pandemic has, we know, produced new vulnerabilities and compounded existing vulnerabilities, particularly in groups that experience relative poverty, race, language, disability, and of course, gender considerations, and how these intersect. So it's also the intersecting nature of that. And we also want to be clear that existing emergency and conflict contexts will have even more compounded effects. So we want to think about how the system at the institutional level will be functioning at that level in terms of thinking of the experiences of those groups and how we might put forward targeted initiatives for them. Next slide, please. So what were the guiding considerations when we came up with our recommendations? There were really 3, and I'm not going to spend too much time because it was covered, but the guiding considerations, our guiding assumptions were, first, there are new exclusions and vulnerabilities that are compounded in crises and that they're intersecting inequities. The second is that we must be attuned to bidirectional relationships, as literature shows, and multi-sectoral support. And the third is that this requires cross-sectoral, multi-stakeholder planning, programming, and coordination. Next slide, please. And these are the two final slides. I'm very quickly going to just run through the recommendations in our 4 action areas that we looked at. So we looked at 4 action areas in terms of the issues that we must address. The first was emergency distance digital learning. We know that that was one of the main quick about turns that we took when we saw mass closures. We're also aware that this has gross inequities in many contexts. As I mentioned, almost 500 million children were not reached by remote instruction of any kind. So we have to be very careful to think that this was a strategy that covered all. But the 2 key considerations, and you can read more about this in the brief, is to adapt the regular curriculum and pedagogical practices and introduce accelerated and accessible learning programs for all, and specifically to target initiatives on the most disadvantaged based on their needs. So this is much more tailored approach. And the second recommendation here is to diversify modes of delivery, not just high tech, but also low tech interventions. So you really want to look at it as a menu of options that should be considered so that we can think about how the lowest income households, how the most marginalized households can access this without additional costs. The second key action area was education financing. In this, we are very strongly following the recommendations of other global institutions such as UNESCO, the GEM report team, UNICEF, and thinking about the twin track strategy. What does this mean? A twin track strategy means we boost education resources overall, and then we target specific groups. Now, we are very concerned because we are aware that the ODA, or official development assistance to education, has been quite volatile. We're also aware that in many domestic contexts, education budget has been reduced, but also that it doesn't always meet targets. So we're concerned that the economic fallout of the pandemic, especially on low and low middle income countries, might further shrink those resources. It's very important for us to see education as a smart investment, as a long-term investment, and really to increase that support and also to protect humanitarian and development aid to education through, again, cross-sectoral, multi-stakeholder financing, pooled funds, and that the aid should be flexible, but it should also be predictable. So these are the main recommendations in this area. And the last 2 areas that we looked at were EMIS, or Education Management Information Systems and Microplanning, and citizen engagement for accountability and transparency. So EMIS and microplanning, we really, in order to target initiatives, we must have very good targeted data. And this, in this day and age, is very important, especially in terms of thinking about which neighborhoods, which communities, which groups require certain kinds of interventions. Even if we were looking at COVID-19 transmission, which communities were hardest hit, all of this requires rethinking and adapting existing EMIS data systems and monitoring systems for the objective of recovery. So what extra data or what kinds of systems can we collect and integrate into existing systems that are already there? Finally, in this area, we also want to think about creating data structures that will be accessible and hopefully open access and available to all, but also that identify marginalized groups and areas. So again, you perhaps want to oversample in disadvantaged areas or disadvantaged groups. Those are the kinds of questions that we're looking at here. Finally, in citizenship, in citizen engagement and accountability is the idea that we want to have discourse that is open, but also create platforms for engagement, particularly for households, citizens that are particularly marginalized. How do we get their voices into the system? And how can we do that in a way that institutionalizes that kind of engagement? In this era of mis and disinformation, it is actually even more important and cogent for us to institutionalize those kinds of mechanisms into our formal decision-making processes for education planning and recovery. So I'm going to end here. Last slide, please. I'm going to end here. If you are, I hope you're interested in reading the brief in full, please do go onto this link and download it. Or you can contact us. You can contact me on social media or via email. Very open to having further engagement on this. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Prachi, for your very solid and clear presentation of the brief. Now Tito Boeri has joined us. So before moving to the roundtable discussion, I would like to invite Tito Boeri, Professor Tito Boeri, to share with us some remarks. Professor Boeri is a professor in economics at Bocconi University and a senior visiting professor at the London School of Economics. And he has a very vast curriculum in research, international cooperation, and the public sector. But we are now inviting him in a very interesting role that he had during this year, 2020, because he has been the lead chair of the T20 Task Force 6, and that is on social cohesion and the future of welfare systems in the G20 Italian presidency. So thank you very much, Tito, for joining us today.
Thank you, Alejandra, for this opportunity. And I think the topic you are today addressing are extremely important and have been always at the center of the activity of the T20. I'm just looking if I can take away the mask so that perhaps also will be easier for you to follow me. But, you know, I'm just calling you from a conference that was held today on the new inequalities produced by the COVID-19 pandemic, and we were talking about this. And you know, I apologize for the delay. I wish to be at the very beginning of your conference, and this went on a bit longer than expected. And one of the key considerations we were making today is that while we are learning something on static inequalities, the profile of the losers during the pandemic, and we do see a lot of interesting things and new things, including the very relevant gender dimension of this pandemic, we still know too little about the dynamic inequalities and the persistence of inequalities and the legacy of the COVID-19 in that respect. I can assure you that in the work of the T20, the worries and the concern about the failure of the education system during the pandemic are central. And certainly we will convey to the new presidency, the Indonesian presidency of the G20, the message that they should keep on working on this issue and devote a lot of attention to them. And I hope that you will also be involved, because the work you're doing, the research you're carrying out, the insights you're bringing in are essential. In Italy, we found out that during the pandemic, there was an important effect of school closure on the educational attainments when you measure them in quality terms. In particular, we have been looking at the correlation between school closure that were decided at the local level and also were done in response to episodes of contagion in some schools, and the level of and some tests, some standard tests, you know, that are very much based on the PISA tradition. And we do find that unfortunately the school closure and also online distance learning were not really capable of, in a way, remedying the delays in educational attainments that were produced by this school closure. So, and the person who were particularly hit by this delays and problems in educational attainments, where both were already in a disadvantaged position to start with. There were also consequences in terms of dropouts that are emerging now, perhaps not at the very beginning of the pandemic, but now we see that type of phenomenon. So I think it's a very important issue. When you look at the legacy of the COVID-19, one of the things we should worry the most is indeed about the person who were affected, the cohorts of students that were affected by the school closure. And we should definitely try and find ways to avoid that entire generation are affected by this. One has to say, I was before saying that distance learning was not very effective in remedying to school closure. But I don't want to give only a negative message about distance learning. Distance learning can also be a powerful source of activity for remedial education. So when we think about the ways to somewhat compensate the losers, find ways to in a way reduce these delays that in acquiring education that were generated by the crisis. Distance learning can also be a very powerful tool. So that is something that should also be kept in mind. Anyhow, I don't want to take any more time after your very interesting conference. I wish you to really go in deep in this issue that are so important, and I can guarantee that in the transition from the Italian to the Indonesian presidency of the G20, the message will be conveyed that educational issues are crucial, and the work you're doing is also very important as background, and the type of suggestion and policy prescription that you developed should be very, very seriously taken into account. So thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Tito, for joining us. So we are now going to move to the roundtable discussion, and I'm very happy to introduce the 6 colleagues that have been working very close this year to produce this policy brief. So first, we've got Kiran Bhatti. She is a senior fellow at the Center of Policy Research in India. We also have with us Dean Brooks. He's director of the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies. Amélie Gagnon, she's a senior program specialist at UNESCO, International Institute for Educational Planning, UNESCO IIEP. I think I did it correctly. Well, Ivan Matovic, he's an associate researcher at the education program in CIPEC from Argentina. Nicolas Rouge, and he's a senior advisor from UNICEF in education of UNICEF. And last but not least, Talia Seguin, and she's an associate program specialist also at the IIEP UNESCO. So thank you very, very much for joining us today. And I will start with some questions to 2 of you. I will start, if you agree, with Nicholas and Dean. And here I would like to get into the policy brief and how this policy brief remarks that the negative effects of COVID-19 are especially serious in context of existing humanitarian crisis with socio-economic barriers to education and in education systems under strain. And I was wondering, in your views, what do you think is the most pressing challenge in this context, and was this challenge during the pandemic? And what responses you think were delivered to taking into consideration the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development? So Nicholas, would you like to start? And then we pass the floor to Brooks.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Can you hear me well?
Very well.
Okay, good. So I think thanks for the question, Alejandra. It's always a pleasure to interact with you guys. I think that when reflecting on those challenges, I mainly think about 3 main challenges. Considering that this pandemic has affected up to 1.6 billion learners worldwide at its peak, and considering also that 90% of the countries were able to implement remote learning solutions, one result that comes to my mind is the fact that 463 million children, pupils, from pre-primary to secondary education were not reached by any of the learning solution put in place by the government. And it's 30% of the worldwide learners affected at those levels. And why they were not reached, this can reveal, the so-called digital divide, but also lack of access to basic facilities such as electricity, such as devices, such as, TV, radio, but also prioritization of certain level of education compared to another. For instance, in those 463 million children not reached, 120 are from preschool, translating probably a gap of remote learning solution for preschool children during the pandemic. Also, a strong imbalance according to context. 75% of those kids are in rural settings. 1/3 are in sub-Saharan Africa. And imagine that it was even harder to keep in education the most vulnerable. We are talking about the rurals, the poor, but also children with disabilities, children and girls, very difficult. Second challenge was skilling teachers. As we know, remote learning solutions are really effective if and only if teachers are well equipped in order to be able to switch from in-person learning to remote learning. And while most of the countries issued instruction to teachers on remote learning and provided professional, psychosocial, and emotional support, in low-income countries, we noticed that probably there was a lack of provision of teaching content adapted to remote teaching. So this is something we should reflect on. And last but not least, the challenge is getting countries back to face-to-face learning. Countries were really quick in closing the school as an immediate response to the pandemic. But still, I was looking at the figure from UNESCO website yesterday, and we have still 38 million learners affected by countrywide closure and 700 million learners concerned by partial school closure. We are 21 months after the beginning of the pandemic. So in terms of response, what response should be delivered for recovery, taking in consideration the 2030 agenda for SDGs? So we in UNICEF, together with UNESCO and the World Bank, are engaging in the mission recovering, and which focus on three main priorities. The first one is bringing back the children in school, and so that all children and youth are back to school and receive the tailored services needed to meet their learning, health and psychosocial well-being and other needs. Because school is not only the platform for delivering education, but it's also a provision of basic services such as nutrition, immunization. In some contexts, it's only, the school is a place where kids have the only meal of the day. So it's really important. And the ambition is really to catch back on the pre-COVID enrollment rate, but also really to strengthen and provide comprehensive services integrated for children. Second thing is, to support catch-up mitigation measure. It's really important in that regard to think that we will not be back on track if we do not first assess learning, but also provide some mitigation measure in order to catch up on the learning loss due to this pandemic and this long-lasting school closure and alternative service delivery. And third thing is all teachers should be prepared to address learning loss, which means that they should be prioritized in order to on psychosocial support, but also be equipped in order to be able to assess learning and catch up on the learning loss at school level. More broadly, on a macro level, I would say two things. First of all, we saw that unfortunately no countries could avoid that kind of situation of school closure. So we really insist on two things, and I think my colleague of IIEP will come back on this, is really when preparing the education sector planning processes, strengthen all the risk analysis so that the education system are more resilient with contingency planning that can face any kind of school closure. And second thing is about data. Addressing learning losses and mitigating learning losses requires to assess learning, and unfortunately, very few countries are so far engaged in regular monitoring of learning achievement, and this needs to be really strengthen if we really want to address the learning loss implied by this pandemic. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. Dean?
Yes, thank you so much for inviting INE to this event. And just to support everything that Nicholas has just shared and the critical numbers that he's outlined, I mean, I think that really tells us about the urgency of responding to this crisis. A couple of things in answer to your question. Well, first of all, before the pandemic, actually in the midst of the pandemic, INEE published its report in cooperation with UNESCO. And it's also highlighted in this paper that before the pandemic, there were 127 million children, primary and secondary, out of school in context of crisis. Typically, our sector has quoted the number of 75 million. So this was a critical number to uncover and to emphasize that was before the pandemic. And then when Nicholas shared these critical numbers and worrying numbers of those who've been reached and out of school, it just further highlights the work that has to be done. I would say, as we think about the SDGs, meeting those aspirations, there are a number of areas that we should be thinking about. But clearly, the challenges we faced in the pandemic is, of course, access. Nicholas highlighted well, the lack of access to technologies, the need for maybe things in paper rather than electronic or virtual. And but then it's also really highlighting for us now, and what we're hearing is protection risks and protection risks for not only schools themselves being attacked, for example, but protection risks for girls and for children with disabilities, and and simply things like access to nutrition. Schools often provide school feeding, for example, and children are not able to access that. So there's a whole range of protection issues that we have to think about. And one reason that INEE is collaborating closely with the Alliance for Child Protection and looking at integrated approaches. Very happy that this paper is highlighting that multi-sectoral approach to this work. And then one thing that we're really seeing emphasized more and more by our membership, and the paper touches on this in detail, and we can go into more detail, and that is accelerated education. And the fact that globally, in every country, children, young people will need support to catch up to their education. My personal concern is how many young people and children will not go back to school. And I would say that if we really embrace the principles of accelerated education, we have an opportunity to build the scaffold to support that future that we're talking about. I often think about what I'm hearing from ID members, and I think that this pandemic is also calling upon us to really look at creative approaches. And every day I'm hearing of ways that communities are reaching children with education, everything from self-learning type of programs, technology, of course, podcasts, teachers meeting in small groups. I mean, there's just so many ways that communities are responding, and we want to really elevate that and encourage that further. I appreciate, the opening where we talked about crisis-sensitive planning, and I think that's so critical. And really at the heart of that is to do no harm, to really be looking at what is it that we're providing, how are we planning to really address the issues. And just in conclusion, encouraging all of those listening to please go to the INE website if you're looking for resources that can support your work on accelerated education, on COVID-19 response. UNICEF's framework for the safe reopening of schools is there, thanks to UNICEF. The INE website is a resource for you, and all of those tools and resources, the minimum standards on education for emergencies. All of it's there free and for you to be able to download and available in INE's 5 working languages: Spanish, English, French, Portuguese, and Arabic. So really, an honor to be here today with this esteemed group. Important reflections throughout this policy brief. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean, for your words. And we are now going to move to a question to Talia and Amélie. Of course, it's about data and planning. We know, and the policy brief also remarks, that it's very important to have relevant, reliable, and accessible data to enable informed decisions and crisis during recovery. But we also know that this information is needed to target responses and to boost resources for those most marginalized groups. So considering that one of the guiding principles of the document is related to compound and intersectoring inequalities, could you explain in further detail how education planning could contribute to reducing exclusion, and what are the main insights arising from the pandemic about planning and inclusion? I know it's a very broad question for a short answer, but perhaps Talia, would you like to go?
Sure. Thank you very much, Alejandra, and thank you to you and to Prachi and for the rest of the team. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm absolutely delighted, and it's been wonderful working with you on this paper. So thank you for putting together this exciting event. First off, I guess I'll start just by emphasizing, as mentioned by Prachi, that we're really focusing on this crisis-sensitive approach to planning, and that involves this two-way interaction between how risks impact education systems and how strategies can be adopted to respond to these risks. So IIP UNESCO's approach to crisis-sensitive planning includes crisis and disaster prevention, preparedness, and mitigation in and through education, planning in education and displacement contexts, and also planning for climate change impacts on education. Now, why is this so important to focus on? So risks of conflict or risks to social cohesion, for example, may be exacerbated by disparities in the provision of education, as social grievances may lead to tension. So examining disparities, for example, across ethnic groups or regions is really key to crisis-sensitive planning. So just to go a little bit deeper, a key element of crisis-sensitive planning is identifying and overcoming patterns of exclusion. So first off, and my colleague Amélie will speak about this in a little bit more detail after my intervention, it's just important to emphasize once again the importance of the availability of disaggregated, up-to-date data on the most marginalized learners. This is extremely crucial in order to mitigate existing disparities and facilitate inclusive and equitable planning. Now, once vulnerable groups have been identified, policies, plans, and strategies to overcome these patterns of exclusion can be developed. So a crisis-sensitive approach is important for a number of reasons. First off, it helps ensure equitable distribution of education resources between, for example, regions or groups. In the case of COVID-19, this also includes the availability of health and hygiene supplies to ensure safe school environments. It also includes the development of specific program options to meet the needs of vulnerable populations. So we did see a number of different actions in the context of COVID-19 to foster recovery and enhance equity, for example, through the provision of scholarships to girls or other vulnerable groups, and for example, through targeted back-to-school campaigns. Crisis-sensitive planning also encourages all voices to be heard. So it really takes this participatory approach to planning, for example, engaging parents, teachers, learners, and school leaders in decision-making. And this really helps to ensure that measures that are selected address the evolving needs of school communities. And finally, just a point to emphasize, crisis-sensitive planning fosters social inclusion by promoting values such as citizenship, respect for others, and tolerance. So I know we have the second, the question was kind of in two parts. So the second one is on the main insights arising from the pandemic about planning and inclusion, but maybe I'll hand it over to Amélie to answer the first part, and then I'll jump back in. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Talia, and thank you, Alejandra, for putting us together and asking these excellent questions. As I like to say, you know, educational planning is crisis-sensitive planning. We cannot afford planning for education system without taking into account disparities, risks, vulnerabilities, patterns of exclusion. And our work using geospatial data for micro-planning really tries to connect the super local levels, super local communities with the different levels of administration. And so that back and forth between the central and the super local level has proven important in the past, but now I think with the COVID experience, it has taken full place on the stage. And so maybe touching upon the question, like the aspect of data and how can we make sure that we can make a contribution for equity. I think that the COVID pandemic has really shown the importance of this back and forth between the delivery point, as some call them, the school or the communities, and the higher level administrations in order to prepare the right intervention. And that back and forth needs to be a lot more fluid. We talk about teaching or, different aspects of the education system, but data-wise, this has been super important. And I don't think that there's any government that can, claim to have had the perfect data collection system for, preventing contaminations in schools or for reacting for the school closures and so forth. And, from our experience, I think we can isolate 4 different points on which we need to continue working and improving education system data-wise. First will be on the data architecture. So in the brief, we talk about the EMIS, we talk about the importance of having these information management system. The statistical capacity also of the different people involved in the data chain, making sure that we all know, understand, and use the same methodologies and standards. The institutional mechanisms, the responsibilities, the post descriptions, who's responsible for collecting what type of data and publishing it how. In the brief, we talk about, putting these information out in the open so that the communities can also look at their education system and be able to, make some critical judgment. I mean, positive or negative, I don't know, but, being able to use information for their own household. And also, I think the key question that I could observe, at least in different media, in different countries, different contexts, was really about trust and transparency of the data collection process and the data dissemination process. What we observe is that it has been so difficult to have information on the contamination in the schools or the different parameters that were used to decide on the school closure. Most cases, has really kind of touched upon this trust between the communities and the administrations. And so in that sense, I think that the data issue goes well beyond the education sector, goes well beyond the different crises that we have had experience in the past. But I think for now, it has been a kind of a universal wake-up call that data doesn't just come when you need it. You need to think about it and plan for it. And so educational planning can really support that aspect of statistical capacity, institutional mechanisms, and building that trust with the communities. So going back to you, Thalia, so that you maybe want to complement some aspects of this.
Thanks so much, Emily. I'll just jump in to maybe touch a little bit more on some of the insights arising from the pandemic about planning and inclusion. So a couple of points to highlight here, but one of them actually links up a lot with what was mentioned by Dean and Nicola in the first responses as part of this roundtable discussion. So really just to emphasize the importance of strengthening the resilience of education systems in developing and developed countries alike. And this really aligns with the recommendations in the UN Secretary General's policy brief on education in the time of COVID-19, which stated that in order to avoid a generational catastrophe, governments need to take steps to strengthen the resilience of education systems, notably by reinforcing capacities for crisis and risk management at all levels of education systems, so central, decentralized school levels, Also by addressing systemic inequities and exclusions, which is obviously a huge focus on as part of our work, and then also by ensuring consultation and coordination, both within and outside the education sector. And I also would just like to note how well this aligns with the guiding considerations that we developed as part of this paper. I really do see a strong alignment in that respect. And again, in line with the paper, the pandemic also revealed and really emphasized the extent to which negative effects are compounded for the most vulnerable populations in crisis situations. And since the outset of the pandemic, many countries have faced additional conflict and disaster risks that have further affected the ability for all learners to realize their right to education. I'd just like to conclude on maybe a slightly more positive note that I feel like in some ways it also is a wake-up call. The pandemic maybe highlighted that even if we do have these accelerated changes in modes of delivery of quality education, they really can't be separated from the imperative of leaving no one behind. And again, this is reflected in the paper when we talk about the importance of high-tech, low-tech, and even no-tech modalities. But also if we look at practices like adjusting school calendars to reduce dropout and minimize the impact on learning. So there really, I guess there are a number of different elements that can be taken into account, but I think that this is an opportunity for us to maybe take stock and consider how we can move ahead in a more equitable manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Talia. So I'm going to move forward to Kiran and Ivan. While you're both representing think tank organizations, CPEC and the Center for Policy Research, and both think tanks have contributed to local context, respectively in India and in Argentina, doing research-based and cross-sectoral policy collaboration. So the specific question for you both would be, what have been the main educational impacts in your local contexts, and what areas do you consider that require further research and implementation to support at the moment? So, Kiran, would you like to start? You're muted.
Thank you, Andra, and thank you, Prachi and the others for including me in this very, very exciting project, so to speak. It was really a pleasure working with all of you and developing the policy brief. In answer to your question, yeah, I think as everybody has said, the pandemic really threw up some of the fundamental lacunae and gaps that existed in all of our systems in different parts of the world, and certainly in India. One of the things that really came to light or was very sharply highlighted was the very poor sort of capacity that exists within the system to respond to the crisis. And this was not just in terms of data, which of course was highlighted very sharply as mentioned by the earlier speakers, but very fundamentally, I think one of the things that I would like to highlight, and something that CPR has been working on in terms of state capacity, is related to teachers. That teachers, we talk about how difficult it was for the children, and of course it was, but one of the most hard hit in the whole process were actually also the teachers. And in the Indian context, many of them, when the pandemic was sort of hit and everybody was running around trying to get hold of it, teachers were drawn into a lot of the relief work as well. And I think that divided their attention sharply between actually keeping up with providing the educational services and doing the relief work. And this is a particular problem maybe in the Indian context, where teachers tend to get drawn into other government duties and services. And I think going forward, there will be need to think very carefully about that, especially as the schools reopen and teachers are having to deal with children at different learning levels that come back to school, some having had some form of education and some maybe none at all. So, removing all kinds of other non-teaching duties from their plate would be an important aspect in the years, I think, to come, while they try to make up for all the loss and damage that has been done. That's one part of the teacher's story, I think, that needs to be highlighted. But the other part also is the fact that the system is quite insufficiently, in a sense, supplied. There are a huge number of teacher vacancies. and so now with the fewer number of teachers having to cope with the fact that there has been so much learning loss, I think that's going to put a huge amount of pressure on them. So I think the system really needs to come to scratch and make sure that those vacancies are filled and the capacities that are needed to deal with the impact of these almost 2 years of school disruption will have to be addressed, I think, on a war footing. And in addition to filling the vacancies, a huge amount of vacancies that still exist, would be providing adequate training to the teachers. I think they've, it was hard for them to cope with suddenly shifting to online and digital forms of training. Very rudimentary forms of training could be provided in the short time that the switch had to be made. And now they'll have to switch back to in-person training with very, very diverse classrooms, and with having to make up for the learning loss as well as trying to keep up with their curriculum. And I think that's another area where a lot of thought will have to be given in terms of what adjustments will need to be made so that core and fundamental learning is made the focus rather than making them come up to scratch at the level that they return to school in. So I think in general, it's really the capacities within the system. In terms of having better data at the local level, I know that a lot of teachers struggle to keep up with students. They couldn't keep track with them. Many students left because their parents migrated out of cities. They lost touch completely with them, that there was not enough information at the school level available to keep track of the students. And there isn't, in general, a decentralized local data system that can be brought into play when there is a crisis or when there is something that needs to be done on a war footing. So I think developing that sort of very, very decentralized and local data system, I think is certainly a need of the hour, and going forward would be something as part of the capacity of the system to deal with such situations should be given priority. But I think, as I said, one of the big areas where there is a lack, which was highlighted very sharply, was the vulnerable state in which the teachers are. We just have not invested enough in them. And I think that since a bulk of the responsibility falls on them, as it did during the pandemic, equipping them to be able to deal with difficult situations, crisis situations, situations of diversity in the classroom, inequities in learning levels, etc. I think that will have to be a priority area going forward.
Thank you very much, Kiran. Ivan?
Thank you, Alejandra. Very happy to be here in this roundtable with these esteemed colleagues. Well, as the brief shows, we are facing extremely challenging situation in Latin America. As I was reading in today's edition of The Guardian, and there was an article that titled "A Tale of Two Pandemics: The True Cost of COVID in the Global South." And this article addresses mainly African countries, but I can definitely say that this is also the case for Latin America, because we are facing a shadow pandemic, as it is said there, which it is not only about disease, but about obviously education and among other very important issues as poverty, hunger, and how affects this and to all individuals. In Latin America, we now have 6 countries out of the 25 top countries with death tolls per million inhabitants, and Latin America is facing a very difficult situation because we only have 8% of the world's population, but 25% of the total death toll worldwide. And going strictly to the educational dimension, our region has also been very affected by school closures. Just to give you an example, we have had between March 2020 and February 2021, 158 days of schools that were affected by school closures. But for example, in Western Europe, this number was just 52. So this is a 3 times difference between regions. Now, this is combined with inequity gaps and also reflected for example, in one of the biggest dimensions or the biggest tools that we have found to respond to the crisis, that has been digital learning opportunities. We know that ensuring digital infrastructure, especially connectivity and devices for students and teachers, is a very necessary starting point and a challenge in itself. And however, it is estimated that at least a third of students are unable to access remote learning, mainly due to lack of computers. And in Latin America, this is also very this is represented by wide gaps. We have 74 of the highest income households with internet, but in the poorest, this number goes down from 74 to 23%. So that has also affected a lot the educational opportunities when we had school closures for many consecutive months. So going strictly to your answer on which are the research gaps, we know there, as many of my colleagues have already mentioned, there is still little data on how groups with compounded inequities have been affected and how policies at national and subnational levels can target these groups. And I'm thinking about indigenous communities, about ethnic minority groups, students living in households which have been severely affected by the economic crisis. And in response to these kind of challenges, the two most important ones that I think, and topics that we have worked in CPEC during the last year and a half, 2 years, one is related with prevention of dropouts, and here we must improve. We must develop further research on how to improve information systems and in terms of governance, in terms of contextualized data to understand better local populations and how to prevent dropouts in this special context. And another research gap and another field where we must develop further research has to do with teacher training. The pandemic has meant a turning point for teachers' work, and Latin American countries need to better understand what are the main challenges to accelerate teachers' training, how can systems provide them extra support in contexts with still very limited access to basic infrastructure. So I think this is the very important, these are the two main research fields where, for at least in Latin America, we must work on during the next years.
Thank you very much, Ivan. So to close, I'm going to do a very, very brief question for all of you, but it's not a question. It's basically all of our organizations use research and data to show the importance of and the urgency of certain particular education issues, and also to deliver effective messages that promote action, and that's the topic of our discussion today. So I would like each of you to think of a key figure, only one, and in less than 30 seconds to describe that figure that could help this wider audience that we have today, and is probably going to see this video in the future, to understand the scope and the long-term impact of the educational crisis and the decisive role of governments. So I'm going to go in this order, in alphabetical order. So Kiran first, do you have a key figure that you would like to share?
Yeah, I think for me, the really key, actually, then that's often, it's the statistics I cite, is the figure related to out-of-school children. And in that context, actually, the manner in which the out-of-school children are calculated, at least in the Indian context. And I think the figure that is used, I mean, actually, unfortunately, in the Indian context, there is not one figure, but there are several even official figures for out-of-school, and they range really from like 6 million to even up to 20 million. So I think that, this is again in the context of the inadequacies and problems in the data system. I mean, something as basic as that really needs to be properly estimated if we are to do anything going forward in terms of planning and policy for education. And the key issue within that is, how do we calculate what is an out-of-school child? And a big debate is there between a child who is not enrolled and a child who may actually attend, maybe enrolled, but attends for a very short period of time and maybe very regularly absent, but it continues to remain on the rolls. And a child that is regularly absent while still on the rolls actually doesn't end up learning much. And so do we consider that child as in school or out of school? So I think going forward, a lot more detailed research in terms of what is an out-of-school child, especially in the context of situations where there is large-scale, regular lack of attendance, needs to be done research on, so that we actually have very correct, adequate numbers for for the out-of-school children, and what we need to therefore plan for and how we need to plan for that.
Thank you very much for that. It's not a figure, but a problem relating to a figure that is not clear, and it's very needed. So Dean, would you like to go on?
Certainly, and I mentioned it earlier. Last year, 2020, we uncovered the number of 127 million children, school-aged children, in crisis contexts out of school. Previously, the number was 75 million. And I say that number because now what? What's the situation now? And more work needs to be done to understand what the pandemic has done, to that number, and the urgency of responding to the needs of children and youth globally. Thank you.
Thank you. Amélie?
Thank you.
I think it'd be hard for you to choose one.
Exactly. And I like to be a bit tongue-in-cheek, so I will say the infinite, because I think that one, regardless how we calculate those who had their schools closed permanently or in bits, it doesn't really matter. The fact of the matter is that every single child has been affected by this crisis, either directly by a school closure, either indirectly by having the whole neighborhood and the whole livelihoods been turned around within a few days. And so in that sense, I think that it just tells us that we cannot assume that some people have won through COVID, or that some people learn more or better, or there are no winners. I think it's a zero-sum game, I guess, but nobody lost, nobody won. We just tried to go through. And so in that sense, I think it has a bit of, it can give us a bit of hope to really start working together collaboratively to increase, at least improve the future.
Thank you very much. So we're going out of time. I need to pass over. I'm looking forward to hear the ground experiences. So Ivan, if you can rush through this comment, and then Nicholas and Talia.
Yes, I will say that we have in Latin America 25% of our population under 15 years old, and we will reach our demographic peak by 2015. So I think that educational planning and long-term perspectives are surely hold a great part to play when we think about the generational transformation that we want to see. That's all.
Thank you, Nicholas.
$10 trillion. This is an estimate from the World Bank, and which correspond to the earning losses through the lifetime for the current generation of students in present value and because of school closure. So this approximates 10% of the global GDP.
Thank you very much. And Talia.
So just to bring this a bit full circle, to refer to a figure mentioned by Nicolas at the beginning of his presentation, just the fact that at its peak, COVID affected over 1.6 billion learners, so that's 94% of the population. And just to really emphasize the importance for governments to take steps to strengthen the resilience of their education systems, which is in itself a medium to long-term endeavor. It won't be happening overnight, but COVID is not the last crisis that we will face. And therefore, it's extremely important that the government take steps in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much to everyone. And Prachi, I'll go directly to you to hear the experience. And thank you very much for everyone who participated from this first session of the event today. Thanks.
Thanks everyone for that overview and that rich discussion. I'm so excited about this part of the event. We're going to be going straight to experts on the ground that have been working on issues in South Africa, India, Indonesia, Argentina. We're going to start firstly with a presentation from, from Venola McKen and Wendy Pakur on the situation in South Africa. And I would very much ask the participants, the audience members, to actually, if you haven't already, to refresh your screen if you're watching on YouTube, because there's a place there where you can write questions. And at the end of these sessions, at the end of the 4 presentations, if there are questions, we'd like to take them and address them. So Vanola and Wendy from the Ubuntu Rural Women and Youth Movement will be presenting on community-centered responses to education recovery in crisis in South Africa. And I'm a bit of a bossy chair. Sorry about that, but it's really just to keep time. So when you have 2 minutes left, you're going to hear a voiceover from me to tell you you've got 2 minutes left. Okay, so just that's my bossiness coming in. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Prachi. I'm just checking, is it 10 minutes each or 5 minutes each?
So it's 10 minutes for the 2 of you.
Oh, okay, all together. Yeah, thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Wendy Pakir. I'm from Ubuntu Rural Women and Youth Movement. I'm very honored to be here this evening. I'm a former farm worker, and I've started very late to study as well. So that's why education is very important and excited for me. Yeah, I would like to start off with a quote by the late President, Mr. Nelson Mandela, and I quote, where he says, "Education is the most powerful weapon we can use to change the world." Now, 6 days ago, the Minister of Basic Education announced that 200,000 children has dropped out of school due to teenage pregnancies, substance abuse, and COVID anxiety. Now, that's between November last year and April to 2021. And there's another statistic that school learners lost 198 days of school. Now, I was on the forefront of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm struggling a bit to move my screen to the next slide. Yeah, perhaps thank you so much. Yeah, and what we found, me as a single mother, as a defender of human rights, and being on the forefront of the pandemic, there have been several challenges in the education system in South Africa. The decline in school attendance, as I said earlier, massive dropouts. There was an unpreparedness for online schooling. Our kids were at home for more than 3 months, and the schools were not ready when they had to reopen. So as people that are out in the field having to respond to these things, we also had our children in our homes. I have a daughter at university, her first year, and I have a younger daughter in primary school. And we had to support our children because at first they didn't do any online training for the children. Most of them don't have cell phones. The parents don't have cell phones. In the far rural areas, people do not have cell phone reception. So there were many challenges for the past 3 months in a very hard lockdown when we couldn't move, we couldn't leave our homes. Our children were stuck at home. They couldn't even go to a neighbor because we had a very hard lockdown and police repression during that time. So we had to resort to our own home tutoring and children, talking to one another, and parents, we've been in school many years ago, and yet we had to be the ones teaching children and being there for them. Otherwise, they wouldn't know what to do. So what we also did was to monitor the reopening of the schools when they finally decided they're going to reopen. We had young students, we had students that were finished matric and they were at home, they were unemployed. And we partnered with the commission, the Human Rights Commission. We had to get permits so we could go out into different areas across South Africa, community-based organizations and NGOs, going out to the schools to make sure that our children will be safe when they go out. And we've got a problem in South Africa with classrooms and been overcrowded, and yet we had to send children back going 2 days per week, 3 days per week. It's still like that at this very current moment. The child only go to school like 50% of the time because there's not enough space to have the children in school. We had isolation, we had a disruption of the school week, and we had to resort to community platforms. We were still talking about the fourth industrial revolution, and suddenly it was there. You know, we had to resort to Zoom, to Microsoft Teams, all the things that we didn't know, the learners didn't know. The university students, most of them are still learning online. And they have many challenges. They don't have the equipment, they don't have the infrastructure, and so forth. And that was particular challenges that we've struggled with during COVID. But there was a lot of innovation from the organizations, you know, lobbying government, responding. So we need policy changes. When we went to the school, what is the policy for children with comorbidities, with disabilities? You know, how will you make sure that these children are safe? And what are you putting in place, and so forth? So that's the level that we had to go to during the first months of the lockdown. And even up to now, we're still monitoring. We're looking at how it's going. Maybe you can put the next slide, please, because I think my time is almost up. We've also seen a surge in gender-based violence. A lot of the dropout of schools is related to teenage pregnancies. 35,000 learners in the first 4 months of this year, first quarter. And there's been a surge of gender-based violence, rape. There's been so many cases, so many sad stories. And we've seen a surge in suicides of school learners, matriculants, young learners, 13 years old, 12 years old. There's been too many cases. And the trauma, the trauma by the teachers. There's been a lot of job losses at school, teachers losing their lives due to COVID, and the trauma for the children at the school. So a lot of psychosocial support had to be organized for the children. And we've also seen massive job losses, parents losing their jobs, which meant afterwards when children could go to school, there might not be money for transport. As one of the speakers earlier said, that the meal at the school is probably the only meal. That was also the case. So we had to start food kitchens, soup kitchens in different communities so that learners, when they're at home and not at school, they can at least have a meal to eat. I'll stop there and then I'll hand over to Vinola. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Wendy.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much for the opportunity. We really appreciate being among everyone who have done so much work around this and thinking education through. Coming from a community response, I would like to just put in 2 or 3 main points for us to think about. I heard someone said earlier that we need to catch up with the education system, but I'm thinking what we need to ask the question, what are we educating our learners now for? We are now in a context of crisis. We are in a context where we are living in survival mode, where we had to really look at our safety systems and really our whole society systems. And it's not just the education system that needs to be redesigned. And so I've been doing some writing on the impact of COVID-19 on women. And the title is Web of Life Destroyed. And so it's every system in our society has been impacted and has been disrupted. And education is now not just for the learner to catch up the school curriculum, but we need to now redesign another curriculum where we, from a community perspective, I'm asserting that we need to go to the bush and look at what do we need to teach. We need to go to the gardens. We need to go to our backyards, and we need to go to every place, all the neighborhoods where we need to continue living. And that's where we're going to find the answers. What do we need to teach now? And earlier, before we start the seminar, we spoke about grieving and loss. So there's a lot of learning losses in society as a whole that we as educators need to look at. So we need to learn how to grieve. We need to learn how to feed each other in a new way. It cannot just me feeding my own family. There is too much greater need out there. We need to learn to keep each other safe, because my survival is now dependent on your survival. And that is also a teaching that need to happen in school and out of school. The issue of caring and reproduction of our whole livelihood needs to be integrated in our schooling system as well. And so with our youth, we train them how to go and make training for the older people in the community, how to apply for social grants, how to keep safe, how to wear your mask, and so on. And when to put your things softer. And so yeah. Stick your computer up. Take your computer away. Correct. So yes. So what I'm asserting is that we need to look at new methodologies of knowing and knowing how. Because we cannot use our school classrooms anymore as a means of communication, and the parents do not know how to use all this technology, and the children have to learn from the parents, and the parents have to learn from the children. So it's a whole new design of our education, and I'm asserting, I'm agreeing with the report of the International Commission of Futures of Education that just came out, that indeed there's a new social contract. But the people that need to be in the room are parents, children, school principals, community leaders, school governing bodies. Everyone needs to be in the room. When we design this new educational model, we need to have whole communities involved. In my own hometown, we started Candlelight of Hope, where everyone came and we could give each other support with all the family losses. There were multiple family losses. We could have the children on the radio saying how school is for them. We could learn from the teachers, that the teachers have been overburdened because we wanted to catch up, as if we can ever get back the education that has been lost. It is now lost forever. We need to redesign a whole new education system that will have a new balanced individual as the outcome, a new balanced community as the outcome, and new balanced societies and governing bodies as an outcome, so that we can have the real education as the value, education for a humanity that stands for democracy, that stands for social agency, that stands for human quality of life, and to improve all our life chances. And so it is not just to get the clever ones out into universities anymore. It is really how to create a humanity that can together deal with the crisis that we have at hand. And I think that for me is now why we need to redesign a curriculum from a community perspective where everyone is in the room, and going forward to a new vision and a new future where our humanity is improved. Even if I didn't finish all my modules at school, at least I'm a human being that can contribute to humanity that is needed right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Vanula, very much for your comments, and Wendy as well. I think you've touched on some really interesting issues in terms of really transformative education. So that's something that we can refer to next in our conversations. Next up, we will hear from Associate Professor Nimrat Kanpur from the School of Continuing Education at Azim Premji University in Bengaluru, India. She'll be speaking about learning loss during the pandemic and related issues, experiences from India. And I'll remind you, Nimrat, that if you need slides to be transferred forward or pushed forward, please just say next slide, and they will do it for you from the control room. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to share some of the work we've done at the Azim Premji Foundation to understand the situation on ground during the pandemic. Next slide, please. So briefly, the context. The 1.5 million private and public schools in India, catering to about 260 million children across all stages, have seen a prolonged closure lasting about 18 months. In effect, children who are currently in grade 2 have entered a formal classroom for the first time only in the past month or so. The situation is further exacerbated by the fact that efforts at using technology to reach children have had very little impact, given the stark digital divide that exists in our country. For example, only about 24% of households access the internet across any kind of device. Further, most households have only a single smartphone, usually which remains with the father, thus limiting access to children, particularly girls. Next slide, please. During the past year or so, we have attempted to study the situation on ground. In August 2020, we conducted a study across 5 states covering 1,522 primary schools. One teacher was interviewed from each of these schools and 389 parents. These schools have about 80,000 children from the most disadvantaged geographies across India enrolled in them. The purpose was to understand difficulties faced by public school children and teachers in negotiating online learning, and these modes that were adopted in a hurry in response to school closure due to the pandemic since April 2020. We found that there was very poor digital access for children and families, inadequate and very minimal teaching learning processes, and an insufficient knowledge of digital platforms among teachers who were offered little training or support. More than 60% of children did not have access to online education opportunities. 80% of teachers said that online classes were inadequate and ineffective, and 70% of parents echoed the same view. About 90% of parents were willing to send their children to schools given proper norms of safety and health, indicating their need to open public schools as early as possible. In a sense, the study endorsed the initiatives the state education departments were taking at that time to kind of create possibilities for active student-teacher interaction in physical settings, usually within the community. School closure led not only to the loss of curricular learning that would have happened if schools had remained open, it also led to children forgetting what they knew, to academic regression. In January 2021, almost 1 year into school closure, we conducted a study to assess the loss of learning due to this forgetting. We assessed about 16,067 children in 1,137 public primary schools across 5 states on specific abilities in language and mathematics across grades 2 to 6. We found that on an average, 92% of children across these grades had lost at least one specific language ability from the previous year across all classes. These abilities include, for example, describing a picture or their experiences orally, reading familiar words, reading with comprehension, writing simple sentences based on a picture, etc. As far as mathematics goes, on an average, 82% of children lost at least one specific mathematical ability from the previous year, again across all classes. These specific abilities include identifying single and 2-digit numbers, performing arithmetic operations, using basic arithmetic operations for solving problems, and describing 2- and 3-dimensional shapes, as well as reading and drawing inferences from data. The extent of learning loss was serious enough to warrant action at all levels, and it is now 10 months since we conducted this study. So the situation wouldn't have improved in any way, of course, probably would be worse. To further understand what teachers expected and needed as schools reopened, we interviewed 363 primary school teachers across 5 states in August 2021. Teachers across these geographies shared that besides the absence of the regular in-person interaction that is critical for learning, particularly at the primary stage, The curriculum for the previous academic year, that is 2020-21, had not been sufficiently covered through any mode. They stated the need for teaching to be informed by the learning level of children once they return to schools and not go back to teaching the regular curriculum. Given the extent of the loss of learning, they felt that the assessment of foundational abilities as against class-specific abilities across all classes for all children would be needed once schools reopened. They suggested changes in the curriculum with a reduction in the curricular load to align to foundational abilities. And a conscious focus on foundational literacy and numeracy was suggested by teachers, along with a variety of teaching learning materials, anticipating that learners at very different levels would be present in each class. Teachers also pointed out that given the experiences children had during the pandemic and because of the prolonged school closure, there would be a need to address socio-emotional issues among children. Teachers felt these could range from a disconnect from learning, a loss of self-esteem because of all that they had forgotten, to experiences that they had due to loss of a parent or someone in the family, or because of changed circumstances of their parents. So this was something that teachers pointed out was necessary. They also felt that once children return to schools, there would need to be a special effort to involve them into the school routine again. And a very stress-free environment was required. And for the first few weeks at least, learning should not be so much in focus. Teachers also felt that all these steps, including curricular and pedagogical changes, would be useful only if they were given sufficient time to work on recovering learning loss in their respective classrooms. They also felt that there was a need to cater for some processes, create some processes to maintain the continuity of learning in case of further disruptions. And teachers even said that if you're just allowed to be in the classroom, we will make sure that children are able to learn. So just to echo what was said in the first session, the need for teachers to be focusing only on their primary task as opposed to non-academic tasks that they're often given in our country was reiterated by the teachers. Could we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. While several other studies have also assessed the impact of the pandemic, it is clear that there is no evidence of any meaningful learning through a remote mode. For the past couple of months, schools have been reopening, mostly in a staggered manner across stages in all states. Most states have attempted to address the learning loss through initiatives like bridge courses, dividing textbooks into chapters that children could learn independently, and others that would require in-person learning, so as to reduce the time a teacher would need to spend on a particular subject, and preparing supplemental materials, mostly in the form of worksheets. Next slide, please. So what must be done? As schools return to their previous rhythm, most importantly, the teachers must be given enough time to compensate for both kinds of learning loss, both the curricular loss as well as due to forgetting. As far as possible, all decisions related to curriculum, pedagogy, materials, even school closure, school opening must be taken as close to the school as possible, if not by the school itself. Certain key learning outcomes must be prioritized, and curriculum as well as materials and classroom processes redesigned in tandem with these changes. A concerted effort is required not only to bring all children back to school, but also to ensure that they remain in school. Teacher capacity to ensure student learning in these unusual circumstances must be in focus, particularly with respect to pedagogy and assessment needed to deal with students at diverse learning levels. And again, the planning should be done as close to the school as possible. Processes to maintain face-to-face interactions in case of further disruptions need to be put in place. What teachers shared was that some kind of community-based classes and also the use of volunteers, particularly alumni, was something that worked during this period. Finally, given that the people who will be working closely with the children are the teachers, we must make teachers the center of this entire process, empower them with our trust, with resources and support, as well as the autonomy that they need to help each child in their care to learn. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this, and the breadth of the research is really staggering. Thank you so much, Nimrut.
Thank you.
Next, we welcome Lucia Fesed, who is the Subsecretary of Pedagogical Coordination and Educational Equity with the Ministry of Education in Buenos Aires City. She will be discussing long-lasting transformations, the pandemic crisis as an opportunity to address challenges in secondary school in Argentina. Thank you very much, Lucia.
Thank you, Prati. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to participate in this event. I'm honored to share with you all the experience in managing the Buenos Aires city education system during the COVID pandemic context. So my aim is to present the different strategies that we have implemented during 2020 to support the academic trajectories of our students, in particularly high school students. Those policies have eventually turned into opportunities to apply long-lasting transformations and respond to pre-existing challenges in that level of mandatory education. So I will begin with a brief description of the City of Buenos Aires education system so that you know. You can find some more details in the PowerPoint presentation that you are watching. Buenos Aires is the capital city of Argentina, a country in South America. Argentina is a federal country where the provinces have decision power, authority, and responsibility over the management of their educational system. And the City of Buenos Aires is an autonomous jurisdiction. So in Argentina, education is compulsory from the age 4 to 17, but secondary school was ruled mandatory only in 26. At the secondary level, there are 170 state schools with an enrollment of 100,000 students. And although the internal efficiency indicators have improved in recent years, it gives us some challenges regarding dropout, repetition rates, and learning outcomes. So, which were the secondary level challenges before the pandemic? I will number 4 of them. In first place, the completion of secondary level. Even if the indicators were improving, it was a challenge the relatively low number of students that complete their studies and get their diploma. Nowadays, 4 out of 10 students do not finish secondary school education. In second place, effective inclusion for all students, especially in vulnerable areas and students with disabilities. Third place, meaningful curriculum content and its relation with the current social and economic agenda. And at last, an effective link between secondary and higher education and the job market. So to address these challenges, a set of reforms have been implemented during the last 10 years with the aim of updating the organizational curriculum structure of secondary level, expanding its inclusive capacity, the improving teacher and learning processes. Some of the most important policies were the implementation of institutional positions for teachers, combining hours for teaching with paid time for accompanying students with greater challenges, conducting academic tutorials, and implementing proposals related to the school project, for example. In second place, a curriculum update, which was a first attempt to diminish the dispersion of study plans and degrees so far. The Secundaria del Futuro project, that was a universal policy that channeled the diversification of teaching formats, the provision of educational technology, the integration of content from interdisciplinary approaches, and the incorporation of formative assessment. And in fourth place, the extension of school time, especially in the first 2 years of high school, in order to promote the transition between levels, reduce repetition and early dropout rates in secondary school. So as you can see, we were doing our best efforts to reach a better secondary level, but then pandemic happened. So I'm not now going to introduce you what were the responses given by the Ministry of Education in the face of the emergency situation arising from the pandemic. The school closure in Buenos Aires, as Ivan told us a minute ago, began in March 2020, just 1 week after the classes have begun. Throughout the emergency situation, we can distinguish different moments from school closure between March and September 2020 to bimodality schemes, and finally the reopening of schools and return to full presence classes again from August 2021 to the present. One of the biggest concerns that we have to face during this time was the worsening of the indicators that we have managed to improve. Within this framework, a set of strategies with 3 closely linked goals were implemented. In the first place, to guarantee the conditions to access the pedagogical continuity proposal remotely. Second, to sustain the pedagogical link bond with the school for those students who were temporarily disconnected. And finally, to generate support instances to make up for lost learning opportunity. To this end, extra after-school spaces were designed, such as summer and winter schools during vacation periods and the creation of centers that open on Saturdays. Also, the modifications in the evaluation, accreditation, and promotion standards sought to make the schedule more flexible to achieve expected goals in an atypical year. But now, with the passing of time, we identified that these strategies, originally thought as responses to the emergency situation, were enabling reflections and practices that in the past would have been impossible. Reaching the end of my presentation, I will describe 2 educational policies that we're carrying out currently in the design stage, but with a long-term perspective. So the first one of these policies is the change of the academic regime. The set of current norms that regulate the accreditation of subjects and progress to the secondary level is prior to the curriculum and pedagogical changes that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. Therefore, they respond to a selective logic and extrinsic incentives and rewards. A regime of these characteristics is contradictory with the purpose of an education level that aims to develop students to make personal choices and the responsibility that comes with that decisions, and effectively include all young people by diversifying the proposals and teaching times to accommodate this heterogeneity. As a consequence of the changes that were implemented in this regard during the pandemic, the decision was made not to back down and to continue deepening the change of norms that define life at school and passing approving the school year. Initiatives such as the college evaluation of student performance, the ranking of subjects to define promotion, and allowing hybrid courses in the upper years are now considered as practices that come to stay. So the second policy that we started during the pandemic and that we want to now sustain is the implementation of activities that connect students with their future. Secondary education goals relate to readiness for further education and for the world of work. While the first purpose is well represented in the curriculum definitions, the second goal was traditionally less explicit. At the same time, there is concern about the growing unemployment levels for young groups who, when they do get employed, mostly get informal jobs. So the pandemic increased this condition, exacerbating the vulnerability of the younger strata of the economically active population. Faced with this, we are making progress in the implementation of activities for students in the last year of high school to facilitate their approach to the world of work, which consists in carrying out immersion training experiences in genuine work situations, in areas outside the school and on issues related to their specialization field. These activities aim at providing students with basic tools to search for their first job and give them a basic induction to the rules, rights, and obligations that govern the workplace, and expand their knowledge about the world of work to favor the choice of their life project. It's a great way to generate intrinsic motivation to stay at school too. By way of closing, allow me to share a final thought. The emergency situation generated by the COVID and its impact on education brought about the threat of worsening the indicators that in developing countries as Argentina had been the focus of education policy in recent years. At the same time, the search for effectiveness solutions revived all discussions, making the pending issues and challenges of secondary level more visible. Within this framework, it is desirable to resume the transformation agenda, so that the set of measures to overcome the emergency is coupled with a more inclusive and attractive secondary education, aligned with the current agenda, one which generates better prospects for academic and employment insertion for young people. Briefly, this is my presentation. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you very much for highlighting that comprehensive approach. There's a lot to take in here in terms of the challenges and the policy responses. So thank you for that. Now, finally, to round us off, we are very grateful to Ida Ingura from Yayasan Plan Indonesia, who will be speaking on girls and boys education access during COVID-19 in Indonesia. We give her a special thanks because it is some ungodly hour over there. Thank you very much. And Ida, if you need your slides to be forwarded, you just have to let the control room know. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Prachi. Yeah, good morning. It's almost 1 o'clock in the morning here. Everyone, thank you for having me. And my name is Ida Ngurah. I work with Plan International in Indonesia right now as Humanitarian and Resilient Program Manager. So I think the impact of COVID on education in Indonesia is similar with what has been mentioned by previous presenter, but let's talk about Indonesia. Next slide, please. So I will start with the education portrait in Indonesia, starting from the poverty increase during this COVID-19. So we have almost 10% of people living below poverty line increase compared to the other years. This also forced the child labor increase from 2017 1.2 million and become 1.6 million in 2019 between age group 5 until 7 years old in various sectors. In 2020, UNICEF studied also 4.4 million children school age not attending school who are coming from poor family, children with disability and living with remote areas. We have 68 million children impacted during the school closure. The World Bank study also found distance learning, only online or radio, TV learning has only effectiveness 33% compared to the class learning. So if you see the picture there, unfortunately it's only in Bahasa, but I will try to explain the left one is the national percentage, and the second one is the big city or town is non-treaty areas, and the right side is the treaty area. The treaty area means like the very remote and underprivileged area. For your information, we have 17,000 islands in Indonesia. It's really big countries. 70% of it are inhabitants. We have 34 provinces and we have more than 500 districts. So the percentage compared to the big city one and the very remote underprivileged area, without internet, the first percentage, the biggest percentage is not having internet access to access the online learning, and then not having digital device, handphone, smartphone, laptop, and etc. to access the learning. And also there is no learning media distributed to the student at home. And also there is no parent or caregiver who taking care of the learning at home, and etc. So I think that the challenge we have in Indonesia is quite similar with what we have around the globe. And the last one is the monitoring report by our government on SDG Goal 4 says that education is access to education is urgent in this situation, but the quality improvement in education gap in the economic hardship due to COVID and digital divide and gender inequality is the most priority. Next slide. So when our government sees that a lot of challenge during the online learning, then we try to make the blended learning between offline and online. Apparently, during the first trial in July 2021, a lot of children infected COVID at school cluster because they don't have vaccine. The teacher do not want to get vaccine because a lot of hoax or misinformation on the vaccine, and also a lot of schools do not have the sanitation and hand washing facilities at school. So it also barrier for them to comply with the COVID prevention protocols at school. So in July, there are a lot of school cluster children got infected by COVID. And also before the COVID, we have also live survey mentioned that depression to adolescents are pretty high in Indonesia due to academic pressure and their own peer group themselves between girls and boys. And the other, and on the right graphic, you can see it is the number of child marriage being granted by our religious court compared to 2016 and 2020. It's really high number children get married because of the economic hardship. So parents easily to ask their children get married, and also unwanted or unplanned pregnancy. And the last one is domestic violence to children are pretty high as well. From the data from the our Women Commission, it says that female having sexual gender-based violence are increased 65% in 2020, and domestic violence also experienced by children. Unfortunately, the most what do you call it? The most family who fight that violence is mother, siblings, and then father. Next slide, please. So this is the voice from the girls and boys from our studies in Indonesia. It has a lot of pressure on them. You can see that they are not happy during the online learning because they cannot see their peers. It's social impact for them because it's depressing to not see their peers, and also they do not have the cell phone or too many assignments provided by teachers through online, because teachers do not have capacity to deliver online learning. So also there are challenges for students with disability, as you see on the right story. There are students who are not feeling comfortable because of the impairment they have. Okay, next slide, please. So what our government of Indonesia effort actually, the first one is that we call it Merdeka Belajar, or freedom to learn. Our government intends to have the quality of improvement on the quality because of, like I mentioned in earlier, because our priority is to be the quality improvement and reduce the education gap. So the program of freedom to learn is promoting collaboration between family, teachers, school, private sectors, and community to bring all the children have the access of quality learning. And the second one is addressing the education gaps in the area of infrastructure and technology, policy and budgeting, leadership and community and culture, and also curriculum and learning assessment. Next slide, please.
It's the final minute.
Okay, so what we have, what Plan Indonesia try to support in education, as mentioned by Dr. Prati in earlier slide, that it's not only high tech but also we can work also in low tech technology. So we distribute radio and handy-talkie to group of children so they can study together in a small group. And also we provided cash and voucher assistance for education scholarship, distribution learning material, capacity building, and then work with government on the policy making process and etc. Next slide, please. So we have a challenge. I think it's also similar. We have a limited data for monitoring activities on learning condition and learning outcomes, less motivation of teacher and student because of the distress on the online. Adolescent girls' education is not priority because most of the gadget or digital devices will be handed over to the boys. And school fund that need to be done to support the school learning is used mostly to pay the temporary or community teacher instead of support teaching learning process. And also they are not vaccinated yet for teacher and children. And also they are not very keen to comply on COVID-19 protocol compliance at school, and also the data alignment between what education sector has and also local government has. Another challenge that I forget to add is about the natural disaster, natural hazard that also affected us recently due to La Nina. We experience also cyclones in many areas. So we have flood here. It also affected children that living in education centers during this COVID. Next slide, please. So our recommendation is about addressing the gap because a lot of students still not assessing the offline learning because of natural hazard they experience right now. We still have flood in many areas right now. We also still have children not accessing online learning due to digital and internet access gap. We also recommend to invest in gender transformative education in knowledge, how to in knowledge and attitude and practice, no discrimination, and also promote girls' education. We promote we would like to recommend also fostering we foster global collaboration, right, what we have right now, and also agreed consensus that we have common commitment between national and subnational level to make sure that all girls and boys are accessing the education. I think that's all my slide. Thank you, Prachi.
Thank you, Ida, so much for that context and for all of these recommendations as well, which fit, alongside much of what everyone has said. So, as is kind of our final intervention, we do have a question from the audience, and I think it would be really nice if I could open that up to all of the speakers in the session too. So Ida, Lucia, Nimrat, Wendy, and Venola will go in reverse order, and I will ask each of you to give a brief intervention to this question that was raised on the floor. So the question was emotional well-being of students was very badly hit during the pandemic. But it's also one important factor to address in the learning process. So do you have any suggestions that would to help address this? And the second question, so you can take your pick, which one you want to choose, was, can we also learn from education systems that had similar contexts, perhaps in terms of what you think worked and what didn't in the context that you're working in? So you can choose to answer one or the other. The first was about the well-being of students and what kinds of interventions may help them. The second is really about if there are any interventions that you think have worked in similar contexts to what you're working. And I'm going to ask each of the speakers in reverse order. So Ida, would you mind going first to give your brief interventions, maybe just a minute on that?
Yeah, thank you. So I think I will address the emotional learning, emotional well-being of the student, because it also hit a lot in our project area. I just back from the field to monitor and to see our education in emergency project in one of our project area. When I talk with the student there, it's also they mentioned that they are feeling distressed with all the things with the COVID and even with the blended learning offline and online, because they cannot meet all the friends at school. So what they mentioned to me is that they need some personal recreational kits so they can have something to release their stress during learning at home. So actually, we try to provide and look at what kind of personal recreational kit that support their learning at home that can be suitable for them. And the second one is they need the support system, not only from their peers at school or teachers, but support system for family, because not all family consider the education is important or is priority, particularly for girls. So they need a strengthened support system from their family, caregiver, and siblings, etc. at home, so they can be able to learn at optimum way. Prachi.
Thank you, Ida. Lucia, your thoughts?
Thank you, Prachi. I will take the first questions too. For me, emotional well-being of students is an issue too. What I think is, at first, we have to get better information. And as you told us in the introduction or in the first session, we have to combine the institutional view with the individual experience of each one of the students. So as I have said, I think that we need more information and make the students participate in that survey and the ways that we obtain that kind of information, so that we know what are they living, what they need to be better, and what can we do to make them feel better after this pandemic. So that's my words here.
Yes, so there's a data issue to be integrated into the broader system, right? And at the individual level. Yes, thank you very much. Next, of course, Nimrat, your comments.
Thank you. I'll take the question related to what worked and what didn't. So I think the only thing that worked in this situation is the commitment that a lot of our teachers showed in terms of independently going out there, engaging with students, or following through government-initiated programs which involved community engagement, or in community settings, teaching learning processes. So I think that is what worked. What certainly did not work was this dependence on technology to reach children. It only ended up worsening an already bad situation. I think what needs to be done, first of all, is to actually acknowledge that something really grave and unprecedented has happened, and then to start on from there. That should be our starting point now. Thank you.
Yes, that's, I think, a humane way of going forward. And then finally, Wendy and Reinola.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think the teachers have been thoroughly overburdened, and they are highly wired. They just have enough time to to create that new ebook and the new materials online, and to get their own children ready for school. So I would not propose that we split the burden of the social-emotional education and well-being on teachers. They do a lot of that anyway. So what we have done is, for example, just one project that I was involved in is to take boys to a farm on sustainability, and they learned in 1 or 2 days, they learned about the energy, where you can do battery storage, solar power. They learn how water can go straight from the river to, to serve the whole farm. They could learn about how to plant organically. And there was a hike and a river walk. They did some river tubing. The same depressed children that was constantly online and bombarded by teachers and tutors to learn more, to learn more, to learn more. They left that excursion with excitement and with sparkle in their eyes, because there was a balance. They could play, they could laugh, they could connect with people, and that is what human beings need. And even if they have all the knowledge and they depress human beings, we have not done our job. And so that extracurricular intervention, which is educational, is very important. And we need to have the partnership, like our partner from Indonesia also said, and from India, that we need the collaboration between community and teachers at school. Our president in South Africa has done something great. As part of a job creation drive, thousands of matriculants that do not have jobs is now assistants at school, and they do various things, walking with the children, looking after classes when the children, the teachers are engaged, and so on. So there's a whole range of things, and there's a lot of volunteers, unemployed mothers that walk their children to school to keep them safe and away from gangsterism and substance abuse. So the partnership in COVID-19 between communities, parents, teachers, and non-profit organizations is crucial in order to create this balanced human being that is going to make a difference in the future.
Thank you. Wendy, final words.
Yes, thank you so much. On the emotional well-being of students, I think there's a need that the education department need to bring wellness experts into the school system. Because at many schools you will find one psychiatrist and they have to attend to all the learners, and then there's a waiting list, so you have to wait to be seen, or a social worker. So that's quite a lengthy process, but yet there are learners that are distressed, that I need to debrief. And I know in our sector and in the feminist space that we are in, we've created some feminist spaces where we can debrief and be there for one another. And I think similar structures need to be created in the school environment, where learners can know there's a platform, maybe a platform for learners to come together, where they have debriefing, meditation, whatever form it's going to take, but also where they're allowed to see individual, they can go to a psychiatrist, there can be a network of people that can be drawn upon. There's so many people out there that just wait to be called upon. So government should bring them into the school space, so learners should know that they are not alone. I love the favorite saying that I'm a person because of another person. And if we create that spaces, where we come together in circles of friends, no learner should feel that they're alone or that they should take their lives because there's no one there that cares. But in these spaces, they can collectively look out for one another, bringing these people into the spaces, but also where they as learners build a network of support around one another. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all the speakers and panelists. I'm indebted to you for your insights. I'll hand the mic over to Alejandra, who will just give a few brief words of closure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, and Prachi especially for this moderation. It's been very interesting how this event went on and how this idea of having the educational impact of COVID from messages to action took place. I mean, it's been the first session about general messages and regions and the key messages perhaps for those people of high level decision making, and that's the G20 specific audience sometimes, but then going back to how to get there. You know, it's not only about those key messages, but specifically of thinking how to make those key messages happen. So I really like this mixture of perspectives to be able to think about education in general terms, and specifically what needs to be done with education after the COVID-19, and looking to the future and a more and a deep transformation of educational systems to get more equity and growth. So thank you very much to all our speakers, and we'll go on having this type of discussions in the next G20 presidency in Indonesia. So we'll keep on working together to make these messages get to action. Thank you.